I'm Paul Louis Metzger, the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins, and welcome to another episode of New Wine Tastings, where we seek to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. And today we're dealing with the theme of faith and science and medical ethics and building bridges between the two. And this is the fourth episode in a series on medical ethics, specifically a personalist approach to medical ethics. And I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Robert Potter, medical doctor who also has a doctorate in psychology, religion, and ethics. And we're dealing with this theme of every patient is the exception to the rule. That's our fourth episode in this series on a personalist approach to medical ethics. Robert, thank you again for joining me for this series on medical ethics. And you are a personalist in terms of medical ethics. We've discussed that, what that entails in the first episode. And as some viewers may be aware, my son is in a comatose state. He had a traumatic brain injury in January of this year. And so we've been dealing with this front and center, and you've been a consultant to us related to medical ethics, and we're most grateful as a family. As my daughter said, thank God for Dr. Potter. One of the things you said to us and to others in this context is, in terms of my son's critical care situation, every patient who is a person is the exception to the rule. And I'm just going to unpack that for just a second. This gets to the heart, as I see it, of a personalist approach to ethics and medical ethics, where every patient, every human being who is a patient, is incommunicable and inviolable in terms of their identity, their dignity, and worth. And yet so often we treat people as cogs in a machine or copies that are easily repeated in society. This way of thinking proves problematic when it comes to patient treatment and prognoses, since we do not know in advance how this or that individual patient will respond in time. So we need sufficient time to see how they will respond in critical care situations. Could you please comment on these reflections, Dr. Potter?
Well, they certainly are right on target for me. You know, every patient is a person. A patient is a person who is suffering. And persons are so unique. You know, in some ways, when you study the social sciences and psychology and the way we are formed as human beings, it seems like we all go through something like the similar stages of life, but we're all created out of a network of relationships, a matrix of relationships. And that matrix of relationships is different, or each one of us responds to the same matrix differently. We've had two sons, just a few years apart in age, 3 years, I think. And they both grew up in the same household, as far as we can tell, treated just the same, and they're different human beings. They're different persons. They see things differently. They respond to things differently. They work together as graphic artists. They have their own company together, but they fight all the time, okay? I mean, there's conflict between them constantly. They've learned how to fight effectively and creatively so that they get along all right at it. But there you are. They're different persons because uniqueness is what it's all about. In addition to that, you know, as I was working with patients, persons are very difficult to get to know. I finally had to just agree that persons are essentially unknown to me. You know, I think about all that unconscious material deep in the lives of every human being. How am I ever going to get in touch with that? Well, probably never. But you know, I had one technique that helped me dig further into the life of every person. I made house calls. You can be assured, if you walk in the front door of somebody's house in 5 minutes, you will know more about them than any hour or two of conversation in the hospital. You know, you look around the room and the pictures that are on the mantle and the things that are on the table in the middle of the room and what kind of a couch they have and so on. All of that stuff together tells you so much about the uniqueness of that person. The uniqueness is what I just constantly emphasized whenever I was dealing with trying to meet people as persons. So That's
Thank you,
my
sir.
take on it.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to pause to see how you might respond further, because how you are going to respond is unknown to me. So
Yeah, right, right. I'm unique enough. You're trying to wait to see what happens next. Is that
that's
right?
right.
Yeah, right.
That's right. And just to that point, we really appreciated a nurse who was treating our son early on in the process, who said, and I think you would have been proud of this nurse, he said, "We're waiting to see how Christopher responds." And I thought that was really striking. Rather than predicting how he was to respond, he said, "We're waiting to see how he's going to respond," because each person responds uniquely, to your point.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The response to an illness is absolutely unique. We study in medicine what we call the natural history of a disease. Let's say whooping cough, people will get the whooping cough bacteria in their body. They will develop a certain set of symptoms, and it'll take 3 to 5 days to really get built up. And they'll have difficulty breathing and be coughing, coughing, coughing. And some will get better and some will get worse. And then the natural history, but you never know how it's going to happen, how it's going to work out with any one person. Not only that, you don't even know how somebody's going to respond to any method of treatment. Everybody has a little different response to drugs, various kinds of antibiotics, or a blood pressure medicine, or something for your cholesterol, or whatever. Medicine has tried very hard to find out if there's something about buried in the genetics of a person that would help give us a blueprint as to how they're going to respond to different chemicals. A lot of work has gone into that. And to some extent, maybe there's a little bit of a payoff. All I can tell you is, as a physician, I used to tell every one of my patients, don't forget, every medicine is a potential poison. And you respond to me, you tell me how you're responding when I give you this medicine, and we'll figure out whether it's still the right stuff for you or not. Because once again, everybody is unique. Everybody is an exception to the rule. And I say, this is the way it's going to be, and it doesn't turn out to be that way. I have to be always ready to anticipate, actually even warn the patient that I don't know how this is going to go. I have some ideas. I know about the experience and the way it goes with other people, but how it's going to go with you remains to be seen.
In addition to anticipation, there's always the adjustment, right? And I think you've said this in a previous episode as well, with, what is going on here? What should I care about? What is the fitting response? And that can evolve, that can change based on how the patient responds. You don't just stay with the same medicine if it's not working. You have to adjust. And I think, again, because people respond differently, because every patient is an exception to the rule.
When I was teaching at medical school, I would teach everybody that would come under my care. I'd say, listen, medicine is the art of managing the unexpected. And so just get used to it. Things will change. Situations will change. Patients will change. Their response will change. The course of their disease will change. Everybody is an exception to the rule. So keep that in mind, that you have to constantly be ready to adjust to what's going on next. And that the whole business about trying to predict what's going to happen next, this thing called prognosis, which sounds like a sort of an ugly word, prognosis, but from the Greek it means knowledge before you. I mean, it's knowing something in advance. So the prognosis, knowing how things are going to work out, you don't really know how your things are going to work out. I can tell you how it's worked out with others that I have seen. I can tell you how it's worked out with hundreds of people gathered in some group and then studied carefully by scientists watching over it. But I cannot tell you how you are going to respond, how it's going to work out with you. I cannot tell you that. On the other hand, I can give you some sense of probability. And I'm sure we'll get into that, the question of probability here in a little bit. But I'll just stop with that, saying that prognosis is really not possible. All I can tell you is what happens to a group of people like you, but I cannot tell you what will happen to you.
Mhm. Yeah, it's very helpful. So knowledge in advance, we cannot look into a crystal ball. We can deal with probabilities, but not actualities.
That's
And
right.
so how is your personalist perspective on each patient being the exception of the rule informed your care for those you have treated in your lengthy career? You've already noted the matter of medicines, and like, could you give another example or two where this is played out?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. And here's an example where I thought we had pretty much decided what has happened, will happen, and ought to happen. A man came into my care because the physician who had been taking care of him said that he'd been fired by the patient's sister. Would I take the patient? Well, I discovered that he was the third physician to have been fired. And I got to thinking, oh, this is not going to be easy. So into my care comes this 78-year-old man who 6 months ago had had a stroke that left him unable to communicate, unable to respond to anything around him. He was unable to feed, so a gastric feeding tube is in place. He had already had his left leg amputated above the knee for gangrene from bad circulation, and the remaining leg was gangrenous and infected. I met with the sister every day, and we discussed what was going on. And on the third day, when she came in the room and I was standing there by the bedside, I said, you know, every time I come in here and I look at the condition of your brother, I think that we're doing him no good whatsoever. We have come to the end of possibilities for him. I think it's time to stop. She reared back, said, Doctor, I've just been waiting for somebody to say that. You know, there are times when you have looked at the range of possibilities and they are now either so narrow or so completely absent that it's time to stop. So that's not easy to get there, because the time that it takes, maybe it took the three other doctors before me, you know, to come to this conclusion, but I felt that it was time now. Had I intercepted him months before, you know, I would have been in a position where I say it is not time yet to say there's no possibility. But when there is no possibility, and you can recognize no possibility, you need to declare that. Make it known that this is your point of view in the case. And, you know, make the recommendation. She could have said, you're fired, Potter. Yep, I could have been fired and somebody else could have taken over. But she said instead, I've just been waiting for some doctor to say that. You know, she saw that we were at the end of the possibility. Prior to that, perhaps not. But that's a case that I wanted to share, in that not every case is full of more opportunity, more possibility. There are some cases that come to an end. Mm-hmm. You know, and the end is plain. The end is there. There is no reason to wait further. And so it's time to stop. Mm-hmm. However, you know, you have to be careful not to get there too soon. All prognosis, all prediction, all probability is under the mastery of time. Mm-hmm. Time has to work itself out.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Thank you so much. And that's something for everyone watching to consider. How much time is actually needed to make a determination. And I think often it's the case that there's more of a predisposition to rush things in society today. Now, other times people might linger on too long with making determinations, but it is quite the challenge to discern how much time is needed in each situation.
Okay, I look pretty smart with that case for the old fellow with the bad leg. Let me give you another one. 38-year-old man had a tonsillectomy. You just don't do tonsillectomies in 38-year-old men, but he had one, okay? This is back in the 70s when I was first in practice. I didn't do it. I mean, somebody else did. Because he was older, because the blood vessels change in the bed of the tonsil in such a way that when the surgeon got in there and was removing the tonsil, he caused tremendous bleeding. The man bled to death on the operating table. I was called to the operating room because I was working inside the hospital because I was managing an educational program while practicing. So went to the operating room. We worked for 9 hours with resuscitation. The man's pupils dilated and were fixed. That's a sign of brain death. At the 9th hour, we said, let's stop. 30 minutes later, his heart started again. 24 hours later, he got up and walked home. Huh? You say, huh? I mean, I said, we are done here. I was convinced we are done here. This man is not going to be revivable. And he was. I share that, Paul, I've shared that with you because, not because we're so dumb about prognosis. It's that we get fooled so often about prognosis. And it is one of the most untrustworthy activities that we do as physicians, is to make decisions about prognosis. I thought 9 hours was long enough. I was wrong. 9 hours was not long enough. We needed to wait 9.5 hours, which we did, and the man woke up. Not just woke up, walked out of the hospital 1 day later. An experience like that, Paul, it is a chastening experience. It's a humiliating experience. It's a thing that drives me to humility about predicting what's going to happen next. That's why I shared it with such passion, okay? It's not that everybody's going to have that experience. That was an experience I had. And coming in the first year of my medical practice, it was highly instructive as to how I should behave in the rest of my practice. Well, perhaps you have some other questions to ask me and get me calmed down here a little bit. I've just got awfully passionate about that story.
Well, those are riveting accounts, especially the second is a riveting account.
Yeah.
And, with that in mind, I'd like to ask you, how have you seen the personalist principle of allowing each patient to, in a sense, inform how you're going to respond as a doctor, to anticipate, to adjust? How have you seen this personalist principle of treating every patient or patient who is a person as the exception to the rule violated over the years? I wouldn't per se call what you did a violation. Your sense was that it was over and you said, I was wrong,
Yeah.
but where you've seen people rush too quickly or something else.
Yeah. Rush too quickly. Rush too quickly. I remember a case that this was a seminary professor that I knew pretty well. He was he had retired. He was now it's like 76, 77. Very unusual. He had a meningitis. Meningitis in the elderly is not a common disease, but he came in very, very sick. And within 24 hours became unconscious. And I could not get his temperature down. And his vital signs were terribly unstable. And his coma was becoming more and more profound. And on the 13th day, I said, we've come to an end here. There are no more possibilities. His wife wanted to continue. And I think I was acting perhaps a little hastily, because in the next week he awoke and in time revived, got up, dressed himself and walked out of the hospital. And there's where we were trying not to be hasty, but in fact I was. And I think what I was doing was that I was pressing my point of view over the point of view of the family. But it's true. They've only seen meningitis once. I've seen it, 50 times by that point in my career. I thought I knew what was going on. And I think that in training others in medicine, the events that I've observed carefully about, failing to understand that each person has to work out all of the possibilities before we stop. All the possibilities have to be developed, worked out, recognized until it's time to stop. That is essential. And I think that has become, that's become an ideal that only partially is actualized in practice.
Could you spell that out again? Could you make that point again, please?
Yeah, the point is that there is this ideal that we ought to let all the possibilities that exist for a patient work themselves out before we declare that we're at the end. That's an ideal that I think the medical profession embraces. But I'm not sure that we act it out in reality completely. And I don't think it's mainly because we don't want to spend the money taking care of somebody who's not doing any good. Occasionally I've been, beat up by nurses saying, Potter, why are you torturing this poor old soul who isn't going to make it? And I said, well, I still think there's some possibility. Well, not very much possibility. I said, well, let the possibility work itself out. But it is tempting to stop when you think that you're doing nothing possibly good. But, it is, the point is this, Paul, I think the ideal of letting all the possibilities work themselves out and not playing the probabilities game too tightly is an ideal that we embrace. But when it comes to the practicality, we often come to the conclusion that it just isn't the right thing to do, to keep pushing this poor old soul a little further, a little further, a little further, just to see if possibly they could wake up. I can hear myself say it. I've heard it said to me, Potter, what's going to happen here. Well, I don't know what's going to happen here is what I respond to, and it's not easy to maintain that point of view. You begin to look like somebody who's just beaten the dead horse kind of a thing, but I hold to that principle that the possibilities ought to work themselves out, period.
And I've really appreciated that in the context as we've been analyzing our son's situation. We've had to deal with probabilities, possibilities. Well, I don't want to get into the weeds or into too many details here. I have appreciated when one doctor said, we ultimately don't know. And I've appreciated the empathic aspect of even a nurse saying, I so feel for you and your family in this situation. There's that sense of living in the tension, living in the ambiguities in both situations. We talked about objectivity and empathy last week, but as far as this matter of probabilities and possibilities, how have you come to determine in patient care what a sufficient amount of time is for making prognoses? Must have been based on experience.
Well, Paul, here is what I have to be cautious with. I can make my determination that we've come to the end of possibilities. And when I say that I want to extend the possibilities to the maximum, that's good. But I also want to say, let's stop when I think we ought to stop. But I must negotiate that. And I like the word negotiate here because it's what has to happen. I need to negotiate with where those who are making decisions, where they are in the same process. If it's the patient that I'm working with. If the patient says, oh, yes, Potter, I am worn out. I know no matter what the possibilities are, I want it to end now. You know, that's one point of view. And I respect that. And it may be with that, I might even argue against that with him, you know. And so until we negotiate to where we both feel like we are in the same range together of facing the reality of the situation. So often, however, in these kind of difficult problems, you're dealing with a family or a loved one, or maybe a friend even. And, you know, working with them until their sense that the possibilities have been exhausted begin to match up with your sense that the possibilities are exhausted. That's where the negotiation comes in. That's where ethics becomes working with people and not imposing your sense of what ought to be done on those who have a moral buy-in to the situation. And that's where you always have to, I, as a physician, I have to be careful not to too vigorously impose my point of view onto the situation. Even that case where the old gentleman with the bad leg, you know, I was just a little bit uncertain as to how well my recommendation to stop would be received. And if the sister had said, "Oh no, we need to keep going," I would have negotiated with her to say, "Okay, let's see if we can agree as to how much further we'll go. Let's look for some kind of a stopping clue, some clue that it would now be time to stop." And if we could agree to a clue like that, you know, at something identifiable, something we could measure, something we could observe, that would be so good. That would be so good. And sometimes you can arrive at that. Sometimes you cannot. Sometimes you just simply cannot find an agreement, a negotiated settlement, if you will, as to when the possibilities are exhausted. But my point of view as physician, in treating people as patients, as persons, and treating those who are concerned with the patient as persons, I am willing to negotiate until we are together. and in agreement on what
Well,
needs to
Robert,
happen. Yeah.
Robert, I apologize. We lost the connection for a second. You were saying that would be so good, that would be so good. And it was the whole matter of if you could come to a point of agreement.
Yeah. Okay, let me just repeat it. You know, when you're dealing with the patient as person and the persons that care for the patient, you know, I think it's important for me to express where I feel we are in the range of possibilities. But I don't want to, should not, and I will not impose that on to the others. We have to keep negotiating until we have reached a point where we agree as to where the possibilities are. And if we agree the possibilities are exhausted, it is time to stop. That's the thing to do. Until we reach that point, you know, I'm not willing to give up. There have been, I'll admit, Paul, there's been one or two cases where I have been tempted. I never have, but I've been tempted to ask to be dismissed from a case where I felt like we had simply exhausted possibilities and others wanted to continue. You know, I've been tempted a time or two, but I've never had to follow up on that. Mm-hmm. But once again, I think the personalist approach to ethics and decision-making in medicine requires that you bring persons together in their various valuations of the situation until you have negotiated agreement as to where we are in the possibilities.
Thank you so much. And again, without going into details, we've been in discussions about these matters related to my son's situation, to Christopher's situation. And we have come up with a game plan, a big picture scenario. We have determined to hold to that scenario as we've been in dialogue as a family with you and with others. I bring that discussion to bear on every conversation I have with medical professionals who are engaging us, and I share that with them. I share with them how I'm reading a given observation or information that they're giving based on their observations. And that whole idea of negotiating, I like to verbally process with them and say, here's how I'm seeing this. I'd like your response. How are you hearing me? And what are your thoughts? I welcome your input. And you've appreciated that dialogical approach. I come in with my big picture. I come in with my own personalist perspective. I look at the data. I say, here's how I'm seeing it, doctor. What do you think of how I'm seeing it? And it's not a relativistic orientation, but it's a dialogical big picture process with our big picture in place. And I'm saying this in part for other people going through this, is have a structure, have a strategy, dialogue with medical professionals and the like, make observations, ask them for their input. Your thoughts on that particular approach, and not only for myself, but for our viewers and the like.
Oh, that's absolutely on target. In fact, I like your word dialogue, and rather than negotiate, negotiate sounds a little like we're trying to overcome a dispute of some sort. But yeah, whether you call it dialogue or negotiate or come to cooperation, however you want to express that, it is important. And when I see success in caring for complicated and tragic cases, the success is when there is full, open dialogue among those who are involved in. We in ethics we call them, everybody involved, stakeholders. Mm-hmm. You know, everybody's got a stake in the issue. They've got values that they want met. They've got loves that they want honored. They want the value. They want rights to be respected, etc. And you know, everybody that are stakeholders in the situation need to come together until we reach conclusion that is satisfying as much as can be satisfying to as many as possible. And so let me give just a little side bar dialogue here. I often in my teaching say that ethics is a practical strategy for preventing, resolving, and coping with moral problems. Now, that's sort of a formal statement, but what I mean is that ethics can sometimes being ethical and being dialogical between patient and physician and all the stakeholders involved. If we just keep everything in the open from the beginning, we can often prevent ethical impasses where we're at odds with one another. We can often prevent those problems from developing. Secondly, if the problems develop, we can often resolve them because in medicine, decisions have to be made. Eventually, decisions have to be made. And the third part, coping with moral problems, is this. Once you've made a decision, it is so often that somebody who's a stakeholder does not get their value respected. And they go away unsatisfied, not in agreement. They go away grieving, even angry. And you have to help those folks cope with the fact that their values have not been respected in the decision. That's just the facts of life when there are multiple people engaged in trying to make decisions. But so, what I say is that what I see you doing, Paul, is with your being open and upfront with all the doctors and nurses that you engage. They know about your big plan. They know about why you got it there. And that's going to prevent a lot of ethics problems, moral problems, as we say. And a moral problem really is simple to define. A moral problem is simply a conflict in values. I mean, just succinctly stated, a moral problem is when there's a conflict in values. Your values don't match the values of somebody who's making decisions over you. When there's conflict of values. And you're preventing that, and you're going, as issues arise that slip by you and develop anyway, you can resolve them. Mm-hmm. And then finally, there may be people within the stakeholders around Chris's case that whenever and wherever decisions are made, they may not be satisfied, and we need to do our best to help them cope with the fact that their values have not been honored. Mm-hmm. That's a little lecture on the side there. On the other hand, it really gives credence to the fact that you are approaching your moral problem in the proper way. You're preventing, and if necessary, able to resolve, and finally, if necessary, able to cope with the way that the moral problems work itself out.
Yes, and you've been a great help to us as we process this with the medical community, and we come back from time to time where there have been matters where problems can arise to say, here's our big picture. This is what we're working from. This is why we're working from this vantage point and toward this vantage point. And we've been grateful that we have seen some progress in his situation with brain injuries. It's very slow going, and it's painful, and it's stressful. We have seen some improvement. We're waiting to see to what extent Christopher will improve. And we do pray with hope for major improvement. We give time, and we give him time, and put it before God and the medical community. So you debated whether to be a physician or a minister. And I can see Albert Schweitzer there on your left shoulder, so to speak, the great missionary and doctor. He inspires you. Why is that?
Well, I picked him up late in my high school years, and I got pretty much entranced by him. But it was in my third year of college that I reread a portion of his biography. That's this one right here, Out of My Life and Thought, where he said that if he had to do it over again, he would have done medical school first. He started medical school at age 30. And even in 1906, when he began medical school, it was a tough course. Took him 7 years. Well, that's fine. It took me 8 years. I mean, 4 years of medical school and 4 years of specialty training in internal medicine, but 7 years of training. He said it darn near killed him. And if he had it to do over again, he would have done medicine first, then done all the theological stuff later. So I said, take Schweitzer's advice, for heaven's sakes. So I did medicine first, then I did the theological stuff a little later. And now that's not to say, Paul, that the theological stuff was just a snap. It wasn't all that easy. Writing a dissertation is not something I'd recommend for just anybody. You got to be ready to do it. But that's sort of in a way, the story behind Schweitzer. On the other hand, I think what Schweitzer did for me is to help me realize that just doing biological medicine would never be enough. So I can take out somebody's appendix. So what? So I know what's the right dose of penicillin. So what? But if I cannot treat that person as a person and help that person through the illness or to the end of life with the illness, if I cannot nurture that person, I have not been all that I could be as a person. So I did not want to be a physician without the other dimension, the expanded dimension. Now, I'll admit, probably I'm a little overeducated, okay? On the other hand, by having that second degree, I have been given great opportunities to be engaged in education. Great opportunities in my life have been opened up because of that expansion in the direction that Schweitzer was going, okay? And so I just feel like living out the life with this sort of a dual dynamic going on has been the right way for my life. I'm coming to the end of my life at 82 now, fully satisfied that I have followed what I think is the course of God's will for my life. And I give Schweitzer some credit for having set me clear about which I ought to do first. Now, my wife has said, that was actually some years ago, that if I wanted any more education, it would have to be in small engine repair. That was the only other thing she'd let me go back to school for is small engine repairs.
Oh, that is good.
Yeah, right.
Well, that's very good. Leave it to Dr. Potter's wife, Mrs. Potter, to make such a good observation of what's needed.
Yeah,
and
right.
My wife has made similar observations for me. I'm grateful that you have done both. As a theologian of culture, I've certainly benefited greatly, and the work of New Wine has benefited greatly, and Multnomah Seminary with our Science for Seminaries grant through American Association for the Advancement of Science, and Templeton, we've benefited greatly from your dual expertise. And I think it's shaped your personalist perspective in part. I mean, I think you had it to begin with, but I think that it only enhanced it. And I think it helps you see people, regardless of the outcome, as cups half full, not cups half empty. And so that every situation, no matter where it goes or how it turns out, you're not seeing them simply as material. You're not seeing them only as spiritual. You see them as holistic beings, so to speak, what some might call embodied souls, and so on and so forth, or what have you. But Jesus was and is the great physician of body and soul. And how do you see him engaging patients who are persons in terms of affirming their incommunicable and inviolable worth in the Gospels?
Well, I keep reading the stories of Jesus. Right now, I'm working through Matthew. I do a post, about 3 pages of a post every week for about 45 people who are mostly from our church congregation, just to keep, religious education going. And we're working through Matthew right now. I think Matthew made a mistake. I think Matthew forgot to tell us that Jesus asked everyone he healed what their name was. I just want to imagine that he asked what their name was.
Mm.
He showed interest in them, did he not?
Mm-hmm.
The woman who touched the hem of his garment turned around. Somebody, who is that?
Mm.
Show yourself. Tell me who you are.
Mm.
No. And he did it with compassion.
Mm.
Now, compassion is our sort of Latinized word that doesn't quite communicate as well to me as the made up Greek word empathy, which they mean the same, which means to suffer with the other. And to me, what Jesus demonstrated was the capacity to suffer with the other person and to bring their suffering to an end. And for me, that is the core dynamic that energizes ethics. It is the core dynamic that energizes the way that I have practiced medicine. When I can, when I have the strength, when I have the courage, when I've got it together and I can act with compassion, empathy, that's when I feel like I have followed Jesus into the world of the sick and helped them through it. And that's where I am with that. The stories of Jesus' healings, I think, are not particularly good clinical descriptions. I would like to have seen more about what happened. How did he respond to the person that was healing? There's some little pieces missing there that I wish had been filled in. I just keep filling them in for myself.
One thing, and thank you, Robert, I appreciate that very much. And one of the things that strikes me about Jesus's engagement with different patients who are persons is that he does seek to affirm their agency. You mentioned the woman with the issue of blood.
Mm-hmm.
I could mention the man who's lame by the pool.
Yeah, right.
And he says, "Do you want to
Great
get
example.
healed? Do you want to
Great
get well?"
Yeah.
Or the man, and that was John 5, and then John 9, the man born blind, he puts mud on his eyes, spits on the dirt, puts the mud on his eyes and says, "Go wash yourself." So he affirms their agency. And the woman with the issue of blood is especially striking to me. I think a lot of people would think, oh, he's shaming her by calling her out, but it's actually, I think,
no,
just the opposite.
The opposite.
Because
the opposite.
Because in part you have the synagogue ruler right there that, look, this woman's healed. She's whole. Welcome her back to the synagogue this coming Friday night. So on and so forth. To your previous discussion with me, previous interview, what is the situation? What ought I to care about? What is the fitting response? He is so aware of his surroundings. It is mind-boggling to me.
Yeah. As I say, occasionally you have to fill in a gap or two in the account, but yeah, mind-boggling.
Yes. In view of Jesus, how would you encourage our viewers and listeners to approach everyone, whether in healthcare or in other domains, as the exception to the rule?
It seems so simple that I hate even to say it, but folks, it's follow Jesus. See what he did. See how he did it. See why he did it. See that he did it. And follow it. It's not all that complicated. You don't need a Ph.D. to do it. Just follow Jesus.
Robert, thank you so much for your time today. And again, as I started this episode, my daughter said, thank God for Dr. Potter. She herself is pursuing a career in medicine and healthcare in one branch or another. She also has a strong interest, keen interest in medical ethics, as do I, and ethics generally. And, you've had a big influence on my life, continue to have that, both academically, in terms of my calling as a theologian of culture, and pastorally and personally, now with our son's situation. So, and her brother's situation, we're really grateful for you. And thank you for your time today once again. I'm Paul Metzger, the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement. Thank you for joining Dr. Potter and myself for this fourth episode in our series on a personalist approach to medical ethics. Remember, we all need to remember, I need to remember, every person and every patient who is a person is the exception to the rule. Jesus treated them that way. Let's continue to follow him in doing the same. Blessings to you all. Good night.